Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many faces in the audience, some familiar and some new. Today we're going to talk about computing for exotic technologies, exotic architectures. Some are more exotic than others. We have a great broad range. We're going to start by hearing about FPGA architectures. Then we'll move to DNA computing and then quantum computing. So we have three experts, wonderful speakers with us today, and we're aiming to have about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. We'll allow maybe one question if there's time in between at the end of each talk, but if you have questions, let's try to save them for the end and we can have everyone come up and have a panel discussion. We're going to start with Jan Gray. Jan actually worked at Microsoft for over 20 years and now consults for Microsoft. He has developed and helped develop Catapult, which I think he's going to talk about in his talk, which has been an FPGA accelerator for model evaluation with the Bing ranking system. So Jan is an expert at FPGAs. We're thrilled to have him here. So I'm going to just turn it over to Jan so we can jump right in.
Good, I think I'm on. Pardon me, I'm getting over a cold. So thanks very much for coming. It's a privilege to talk to you today about my passion, which is computing with FPGAs. Here's the outline of my talk. We're going to have a backgrounder on FPGAs so you all know what the technology is. We'll look at some applications of computing on FPGAs. And then we'll look at the state of the tools that people are using to build these FPGA accelerators. And then I'm going to talk about some work that I'm doing on what I call software-first accelerator design. So welcome to the autumn of Moore's Law, the winter of Dennard scaling. The transistors are not getting more energy efficient. They're not switching a whole lot faster. And so how are we going to continue to get increased computing throughput and performance? Where's the next 10x going to come from? To get that increased performance, we're going to need to dramatically reduce the energy per operation in our workloads. And one way to do that is by specializing the hardware architecture to the workload and the data. And that's driving an interest this time, in FPGAs as compute accelerators. FPGAs, compared to other technologies, are massively parallel. They allow your workload to run on a specialized architecture. They're beautifully connected to 25 gig, 100 gig networks, for example, and they're versatile computing fabrics. So unlike an ASIC, you can run different jobs on the same FPGA over time. Now, compared to CPUs and GPUs, FPGA solutions offer higher throughput, lower latency, particularly on networking applications, and they tend to be very energy efficient, as we'll see. The question is, so how am I going to program my traditional software workloads on these very spatial parallel fabrics? So just so we're all on the same page, let's look at what is a field programmable gate array. Well, it's essentially just a universal digital logic chip. Any kind of digital circuit that you can imagine can be implemented in an FPGA if it fits in the available device resources. A parallel compute server, a network router, whatever you like. At the most fundamental level, the programmable gate part of FPGAs are called lookup tables, or LUTs. And it's basically a Boolean truth table. So you populate this truth table with ones and zeros to represent the Boolean logic function you're trying to implement. In this example here, all the entries in the table are 0 except the 7th entry, 111, which has a value of 1. So this lookup table computes an AND function over those 3 inputs. By changing the contents of the lookup table later, you can implement a different logic function. In this case, we're computing XOR over those 3 inputs. Now, if we compose a lookup table with a flip-flop, we're now ready to start to implement both combinational and synchronous digital logic. As we see here, this lookup table has 6 inputs, and that's pretty much the number of inputs on modern FPGA lookup tables. There's 6 input lookup tables. At the next level up, we can compose, say, 8 of these logic elements together into a cluster called a configurable logic block. And then we add some local interconnect that can programmably connect the outputs of these lookup tables to the inputs of other lookup tables. And with this 8-element design here, we can compute up to 8 digital logic functions of 6 inputs. We could build an 8 8-bit wide ALU, or we could even build a 64-entry 8-bit wide static RAM. So we can build small memories with these lookup tables as well. Now at the chip level, the chip is filled with many, many, many of these configurable logic blocks, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of them. And they're all interconnected on a chip-wide programmable interconnect fabric. These are little aluminum wire segments or copper wire segments, plus pass transistors and multiplexers that allow the outputs of each block to be fed to the inputs of other blocks and implements fan out and so forth. There are also I/O blocks so that you can route internal signals outside of the device, or you can take input from outside of the device. And there are a number of different kinds of fixed logic blocks. One type is a memory block called a block RAM or BRAM. They're typically about 4 kilobytes in size, and an FPGA might have hundreds or thousands of these. You also have a number of math blocks called digital signal processor blocks that implement fixed point, multiply, and add. And the more recent FPGAs from Altera also do single precision floating point multiply add. And again, you might have several thousand of these in the FPGA. And many other types of fixed logic blocks, many for doing high-speed communication off the chip. Now, modern FPGAs are also heterogeneous systems on a chip. So you start to add an ARM-SOC tile into the same FPGA device. And in the new high-end FPGAs, these typically have 4 64-bit ARM processors, two 32-bit ARM processors, a GPU, DRAM controllers, cache hierarchies, lots of peripherals, in addition to the FPGA fabric. So now you can see that you might take your workload and run some of it in software on those ARM cores or the MMU, and other parts of it in the programmable logic fabric. FPGAs are now also heterogeneous system-in-package devices. So as packaging technology has advanced, we're able to integrate, for example, stacks of DRAM dies into the same package. And so this will be a real breakthrough. Traditionally, FPGAs have been kind of weak on DRAM bandwidth. But with these new devices with these high bandwidth memory DRAMs in package, you'll see up to a terabyte of DRAM bandwidth and up to 16 gigabytes of DRAM capacity in that same FPGA package. So these modern FPGAs that we can start to use are enormous devices, up to 2 million lookup tables, hundreds of millions of bits of on-die static RAM, thousands and thousands of these math blocks, dozens of high-speed Ethernet connectivity, and hundreds of transceivers. And with that, you can achieve systems with really massive supercomputer-like parallelism and bandwidth. In aggregate, you can do 10 to the 15th bit operations per second. You can do 10 teraflops of floating point across those floating point DSPs. And you have enormous memory parallelism. So each clock cycle, you can do 5,000 memory accesses into all those block RAMs and 100,000 memory accesses into those small lookup table RAMs if you configured them that way. In aggregate, you can get 50 terabytes per second of local memory bandwidth and 1 terabyte per second of bandwidth into the DRAM, and 4,000 gigabits per second of network bandwidth. I'll take a quick question, but then I have to save the rest for the end. Yes, Ed?
Compare this to contemporary DSPs. I think everybody thought of using DSPs before you folks did.
Sure. The old DSPs were programmable processors that had instruction pointers, ran through instructions, but the instructions were meaty. They had several multiply adds per instruction. These DSP blocks are fixed state machine-like things. Each cycle you can give them operands to multiply or add, but there's no programmability to them. You build that in other parts of the fabric.
But how about in terms of these sorts of capabilities?
Oh, this is like if an old DSP processor would have 4 multipliers, this is a machine with 10,000 multipliers on one chip, if you configure it that way. Okay. So how can we harness all this computing power to do some interesting things? Well, first I wanted to cite this interesting website from Xilinx about what are we going to do with these future FPGAs. And in general, they're talking about building smarter digital computer systems. So cloud and data center applications, computer vision applications, industrial Internet of Things, and their bread and butter for FPGAs right now in networking, both wired and wireless networking. Now, I've highlighted a few of these in blue that correspond to work that's also been done here in Microsoft, and I'm going to talk about those. So, as Krista mentioned, There is this Microsoft Research Catapult project to build a flexible FPGA-enhanced data center, where with each server node in the data center, you add a FPGA, and you also connect the FPGAs together in their own mesh network so that you can federate a number of FPGAs together to work on problems that maybe don't fit in a single FPGA. And the first example of using this fabric was the Catapult Bing search query ranking system. The problem here is you've got a search, you've got a page that you're thinking of displaying on the Bing page of results, and you want to know, is this web page better than some other web page? So you compute a number of statistics which correspond to how many of each of the search queries appear in the search document. You compute a number of statistics, several thousand that are called features, and then you feed that into a machine-learned scoring model that evaluates those features and produces a single figure of merit number. That algorithm is quite computationally intensive with both parsing and math. And when you accelerate that in the fabric, and in this pilot study, they use 1,600 servers, you end up with a result that doubles the throughput of the server when doing this workload, which is quite substantial, and at a modest additional cost and a modest additional power compared to the overall cost of the server. Another project that's been done with the Catapult team is accelerating deep convolutional neural network classifiers. So the problem here is to evaluate many, many, many of these convolutions, and at the heart of the convolutions are a lot of dot products. And so the team built this beautiful systolic array architecture with many, many, many of these processing elements that do just dot products. Now, these dot products are multiply accumulates, which map perfectly into the floating point DSP blocks in these Altera devices. And so the bottom line is that they got a solution that was enormously more energy efficient than running on a 16-core CPU, 60 to 100 times more efficient, and several, over 10 times faster. Not as fast as a GPU, but you can't necessarily afford to put a GPU in each node in your data center, and you probably can afford to put an FPGA in each node in your data center. A third example of using FPGAs at Microsoft is the Azure SmartNIC, which has been introduced for doing software-defined networking. The idea here is to introduce an FPGA as a bump in the wire between a NIC interface on the server host and the top of rack switch. And now all the packets that are going back and forth into that server go through an FPGA, both for routing, and then you can start doing other processing on the packets. For example, you can encrypt and decrypt them, or you can compress and decompress them. So some themes across these examples are that we're able to run diverse workloads on the same kind of FPGA device. Excuse me. Those examples all have profound, extreme, both compute and local memory parallelism. We're doing lots of math, and we're hitting lots and lots of distinct memories every clock cycle. Whereas the external data tends to stream through. Unlike on some CPU applications, you're not just sitting there hitting DRAM and waiting on external DRAM requests. And in many of these cases, the teams chose an approach where they built what's called an overlay architecture, or some new kind of computer architecture implemented in the FPGA, and then they targeted their app to that. So that gave them both the efficiency of custom data paths between the processing elements, for example, but still the flexibility to reconfigure that design to different workloads with different sizes, for example. So now let's talk a little bit about the state of FPGA software tools. So around 1998, the breakthrough was hardware definition language synthesis. So you would write a behavioral description of your circuit in Verilog or VHDL, and the tools would infer hardware with that observed behavior. So the way you define this system is as a hierarchy of modules, and then a given module would, of course, have input and output ports, local wires and registers, and instantiate submodules, and so on. The implementation flow on the FPGA tools is to take those HDL source files, and they're compiled by the synthesis tool, which emits a netlist. The next step is to perform technology mapping on the netlist. That is to reduce the primitives like an adder in the input netlist into device primitives like LUTs, flip-flops, and blockrams. That netlist is given to the placer, which chooses the physical sites on the FPGA to place those FPGA primitives. And then that's given to the router, which determines how to configure the programmable interconnect to connect the outputs to the inputs corresponding to the net list. If that's successful and the design fits in the chip, then a configuration bit stream is produced. This is a long file, 10 million bits to a billion bits, that's fed into the FPGA at power up to configure all of the SRAM cells that control the lookup tables and the routing. So what goes through the designer's head when they're using these tools is my design going to fit? Is it correct? So they've already simulated it, presumably. Does it route? Does it fit in the interconnect? And does it meet timing? And often that doesn't happen, and so you have to go back, change the HDL, and try again. So this is a challenging and a far cry from the software development experience. It's quite low level. You're dealing with weak abstractions. You're dealing with what pins are on the FPGA and what's the board and so on. You have poor languages that represent kind of 1980 design, programming language design. And it's poor portability. So next year, someone puts out a slightly better chip, and you have to start all over. Your old design may not work on the new chip. Worst of all, it's quite a slow process. It can take an hour, it can take 3 hours for your design to go through this tools flow. Despite this, this is still the way that most FPGA designs are done, partially because it allows the designer low-level control of how the resources are used on the device. More recently, there's been interest in compiling C into gates, and the first of these products is called high-level synthesis, or HLS. In this world, the module is not Verilog, but it's a dialective C. There's certain restrictions, like you can't use recursion or you can't use the heap. And the compiler compiles your C function, and it looks at all the data, so it figures out what are the ports that are the inputs and outputs to this module. It figures out the bit width representation of all the data. For arrays, it figures out how to put the array into different memory cells in the FPGA. And then for the control and data flow graphs, it figures out how to optimize all the loops in this function. So you might want to unroll loops or pipeline them, etc. The output of all that is a data path and a finite state machine that has the same behavior as is inferred from the C code that was the input to the tool. A nice property of these tools is that they kind of capture and semi-automate expert knowledge about how you can map the different parts of the data path in the C code into the FPGA efficiently, and that affords faster design space exploration. So here's an example where we have a very boring integer 16 by 16 matrix multiply with the traditional 3 nested loops. And if you feed this into the HLS tool, it generates a rather poor result that takes 25,000 clock cycles. On the other hand, if you're an expert designer and you add some directives and pragmas to this, you get a much better result. So in this code here, we've, instead of doing 32-bit integer multiplies, which don't fit in a single digital signal processing block multiply, we're going to do 18-bit data. So 18-bit arrays come in, 18-bit arrays are going to come out, and we're going to be adding 18-bit dot products. We've also instructed the tool to partition the arrays so that they have multiple read ports, and to fully unroll the inner loop. When you do that, it can launch a dot product every cycle for each different point in the outer 2 loops, and you get a result that's 100 times faster. And now this is something that can rival a CPU for both performance and energy efficiency. To use this kind of C to gates tool, though, you still have to think like a hardware designer. You still have to have an idea of what the FPGA architecture is and have a good FPGA implementation in mind, at least to know, am I done yet? So you have to determine what to unroll, pipeline, etc. And in the end, you only have a module. So you still have to compose that module into the system, and you have to interface that system to the board, the host software stack. Still a lot of work. The next advance is compiling OpenCL code to the FPGA directly. So OpenCL is a programming language and tools and APIs for programming heterogeneous machines. And people use it today to program to GPUs and CPUs, and now to FPGAs. The beauty of it is it captures the whole computation on the heterogeneous machine entirely in software. So for example, for data, you can describe how the data is laid out, where it lives on the host, how the host buffers are copied to the device, where the data lives in the device memory hierarchy, how that particular bit of data gets to that particular function unit. You can capture all of that in some C code. And so you don't have to go down to the level of the physical device notions. As with the high-level synthesis C compiler, the kernel takes your kernel the compiler takes your kernel function, does all those optimizations and analysis that I described, and again builds a deeply pipelined data path and state machine to control it. The beauty of these tools is that they're portable, so that if you have a correct OpenCL workload, it can run on the CPU, the GPU, or an FPGA, or the next FPGA, or the same FPGA but a different board, etc. Believe it or not, until this tool, we haven't had a good way to do that. But it's not performance portable. The directives and annotations that you put in your code to help with fast execution on a GPU won't necessarily optimize the code well for execution on an FPGA. But again, you still have to think like a hardware designer. You still have to have that good result in mind, and you have to determine how to unroll and restructure your code to get a good result. However, you don't have to do the chore work of interfacing it to the system, because you have infrastructure. You have PCI Express interfaces and device drivers, and all of that is provided by the OpenCL infrastructure, so you don't have to build those things. The other good news is that you can then take your C code and wrap it in an API and give that to other people to call. So you can package up these accelerator functions as libraries, linear algebra, computer vision, etc., and give those to other C programmers who don't know that under the hood your data is being shipped off to the FPGA. So I think this OpenCL to FPGA flow is a breakthrough, and it's necessary, but it's not sufficient for all the different kinds of software that we want to run on these FPGA accelerators. There's almost no code today that's written in OpenCL already, and there's certain kinds of legacy C and C++ code that are not going to map well into OpenCL. A bigger problem, perhaps, is that the bit streams that come out of the tool are perfectly optimized for the specific kernel that you gave them as input. And if you change a single line of code in the kernel, you have to go through that 3-hour rebuild pipeline again. So now I'm going to talk about what I'm doing in this space, which is software-first accelerator design. The idea is sometimes it's easier to have the insight about how the accelerator works and build that than it is to hook it up into the system and figure out what parts of the software have to be moved into Verilog and all that kind of stuff. And then even when you've done that, where you have the software version of your workload and an accelerator, you then have a maintenance problem. When you get a new insight and you want to change the software, you then have to go and also change the Verilog or the other representation of the accelerator. So that impacts your agility. So the idea instead is, imagine that we had an FPGA that was configured to have many, many processors that could run various parallel programming models that were available on the host and on the FPGA. Then you could take your code, compile it, and quickly get it running on the FPGA. And as the code changes, you just recompile it again to get it running on the FPGA. So you get to keep the common code base. You can still add custom hardware acceleration. So you can still take that hot inner loop in your encryption routine and turn it into a special hardware block that's added to the processor as another function unit. So this gives you a design iteration that involves more software recompiles and fewer FPGA place and route jobs. The hardware infrastructure for this is a parallel processor I've built called Groovy Phalanx, which is a terrible name. Groovy is an FPGA-efficient implementation of the new Berkeley RISC-V instruction set architecture. So this is a 32-bit integer RISC-V processor. It's around 300 LUTs. It's around 300 MIPS. So the figure of merit in terms of performance divided by area is about 1 MIPS per LUT. Phalanx is a framework for composing these processors together with accelerators and I/O controllers on a 2D torus NOC called Hoplite. So for scale, in the bottom right corner there is one of these Groovy soft processors in a mid-sized, not even one of these giant FPGAs, but a mid-sized FPGA. So there's about resources for about 750 processing elements in this FPGA. But the FPGA only has 600 of these block RAMs. So how are we going to organize the memories and the soft processors together to get a useful and easily programmed parallel machine? The approach I took was to build a cluster architecture. So a cluster tile will have 8 processors that have some shared memory kernel. I got a pointer here. We have small kernel memories here, and then the 8 processors have shared memory access to a 32 kilobyte cluster data memory, which is 4-way bank interleaved. In addition, you can hang accelerators off that same memory. So the processors can work together through shared memory, or they can collaborate with accelerators through the shared memory. Or processors can directly interact with accelerators off the shared memory. Now, to compose these cluster tiles together, they live on this network on a chip. So every cluster gets one of these hoplite routers that's configured to have 300-bit wide links. And that means that you can have a payload of address and 32 bytes of data. So you can have a processor make an image of a message in its cluster data memory, and then send in one cycle that 32-byte message to some other cluster. And similarly, a 32-byte message might come in from the network and be delivered into this cluster data memory each cycle. And the accelerators can also send and receive these 32-byte messages per clock. So this is the physical implementation of one of these tiles, which has 8 processors and then some other logic for interconnect and NOC router. And when you tile the whole FPGA full of these, you end up with a network on a chip that has 10 rows by 5 columns, each of which has a cluster of 8 processors and one of these cluster memories. So altogether, you get a design with 400 processors. Its peak not to exceed throughput is under 100,000 MIPS. The total memory bandwidth into the cluster data memories is about 600 gigabytes per second. If it's just sitting there idling in some spin loops, it uses about 12 watts. And when it's doing this matrix multiply workload, it's 18 watts. So how else do you program this machine? You can have an OpenCL compiler that, when it does one of these parallel kernel invokes, launches a work group, each work group instance to one of these clusters. For packet processing, you can do a Gatling gun kind of pattern, whereas each packet arrives at 25 gigabits or 100 gigabits per second. You can deposit the image of that packet into successive clusters. So a given cluster of 8 cores and its accelerators has 50 packet interval times to work on that packet before it has to send it off and be ready for the next packet. And you can, of course, do traditional message passing process network type workloads on this architecture. Because it's implemented in FPGA, as I said earlier, you can accelerate any aspect of the design. You can add custom function units, custom accelerators, or standalone accelerators, and compose them into this system. You can have a hybrid where the other kind of OpenCL data path is also sitting on the network and composed with these soft processors. So that's the content part of my talk. This is my last slide where I've tried to capture some research problems in FPGA computing, and I'll just briefly run through these. I told you that place and route times are a real tax on all FPGA developers. I don't think we've done enough to look at how we can slash the place and route times, either in software tools or in changing the FPGA architecture. The second question, when we're building these complex heterogeneous systems, how can we concisely specify them and then expose that for debugging and profiling? How can we automate energy optimization across one of these FPGA, complex FPGA systems, or even a cloud-wide aggregation of them? If we're building these custom accelerators, how are we going to share them between multiple threads that want to use the same accelerator? How are we going to virtualize them? For accelerators where the correct answer really matters, how can we build efficient reliability and fault tolerance into the system? For these compilers, HLS and OpenCL, how do we know that you've got a consistently high quality result? And I'll just skip ahead to the last two. If you've built an FPGA overlay that looks great, which of those should then get cast into a fixed function ASIC component in your next Intel processor, for example? And then finally, the education component to this, how can we use FPGA accelerators in our future computer architecture classes? So thanks very much. I guess I can take one question, and then we can catch some more questions at the end.
Let's first thank Jan.
Thank you. Any questions?
Is there a question for Jan?
Okay. Really, really nice talk. Thank you very much. So wanted to ask about the future of tools for FPGAs, right? So it sounds like OpenCL sort of makes a little bit of progress. You know, it's really nice, but I mean, it's still super brittle, right? And you alluded to that yourself. So are you optimistic or not? You know, I mean, it's been like 20 whatever years of development, and like it's still crap, right? But like FPGAs are really popular now, and like I think Catapult has really propelled it into the limelight. So it's a matter of like, you know, top PL people, top compilers people just jumping in and like boom, 10 years done or not.
Well, a couple of points. I agree that Microsoft is making serious investments in FPGAs, and also Intel, which acquired Altera for $17 billion. They're going to want to make sure that their customers can realize the value of this stuff. And Intel also has very deep programming language and parallel computing tools assets. So the idea of doing OpenCL to FPGA, I first heard about maybe 5 years ago. And the first wave of tools are still just coming out. I was on email to my vendor trying to get the Xilinx OpenCL tools, and it's still hard to pry them out of their fingers. But both vendors are building this tool chain, and I think that you'll have that useful co-opetition where someone will benchmark a thing, they'll beat the other guy by a factor of 3, the other guy will pick up those optimizations and so on. It's still going to be a long time. It's hard to capture all of the clever ideas that the hardware designer has in these semi-automated tools. Also, the quality of debugging and profiling on an FPGA OpenCL thing is, I believe, not very good. So it's going to get better slowly. And we'll also start to see OpenCL-like infrastructure be the target of other tools. So I think the real advances will be when we start building kind of domain-specific languages and libraries that are aware of some domain-specific property, but then use OpenCL-like tools or LLVM backends as a way to just get the data path emitted. I think I have to stop here, and we'll take some more questions.
We'll take the additional questions at the end. But let's thank Jan one more time. So now we're going to change over to DNA computing. We have David Soloveichik here from UT Austin. He's a professor there. He works on molecular programming and engineering molecules, and he's going to tell us about DNA computing.
So thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. This has been a very exciting conference. Title of my talk is Agents and Reagents, Distributed Computing in a Test Tube. I love that pun. So I want to talk about molecular computation. So of course, the first question is, why do we want to compute with chemistry? Then I'll talk about some notions of chemical algorithms, and then I'll conclude with a few words about the kind of things we actually can build in the lab. And actually, MSR had important contributions in both these areas. So why compute with chemistry, right? So the short answer is when we care about environments that are incompatible with traditional electronics, right? So you can't take a electronic microcontroller and put it inside of a cell or put it inside of a test tube. Okay, but what's the larger goal of the field? Why do we want to do this in the first place? So there are a number of long-term goals. For the sake of time, I just want to briefly talk about this one, application to smart drugs, which I think is really important. And the idea is that, well, basically killing cancer cells is easy. It's killing cancer cells while leaving healthy tissue intact. That's hard. So at the core of this is essentially a computational problem where we want to target cells by detecting a particular combination of indicators, do some computation, and then the output activates some kind of payload which kills the cells. And so the thing that I'm interested in is the computation that needs to happen. So of course, the other side of the coin is We want to be able to understand natural information processing that happens in every single cell of your body. Every single cell takes inputs, has to decide what to do next, actuate. And we have very little understanding of the computational principles behind that. So here is a, for example, a very complex protein interaction network of a disease-causing organism. The technical term for this is hairball, partially because it's very hard to unwind this thing and understand how this works. So can we figure out some kind of fundamental algorithms that happen here? So that's a long-term goal. So yeah, so as a computer scientist, I want to find the appropriate model of computing to reason about when we start to think about molecular computing. So the model that I've been thinking about the most is called chemical reaction networks. And it formalizes the behavior of molecules in a well-mixed solution. And it turns out that there are quite a few other models from distributed computing that relate quite closely to chemical reaction networks. In particular, from concurrent systems, we have Petri nets and vector addition systems. More recently, from people who think about sensor networks, we have this model population protocols. And what all these formal models have in common, they're very good at capturing this computation with anonymous finite state agents. So what do I mean by that? So anonymous means there's no unique ID. There's no IP address that every agent has. So of course, by agent here, we're thinking about molecules, and there's no IP address that we can use to. So there's no unique ID. In fact, you can't even tell that you interact with the same agent twice. And there are finite state agents that, agents have finite memory independent of the number of agents. So we should think about, essentially a few agents can be in few states, but there are a lot of agents. And also, we're going to be thinking about this well-mixed model where essentially any two agents can interact next. So this is like a diffusive interactions that happen in the cell. So let me give you a concrete example of this to show you what I mean by a chemical reaction network. And I like to describe this in a, this particular example as in a, talking about people in a room. So this is the approximate majority example. So imagine you have a room of n people. Each person starts with belief X or belief Y. So in current political climate, this is Democrat or Republican or something like that. And your goal is to quickly reach a consensus opinion in the whole room with the initial majority winning with high probability. Okay, and the people interact in pairwise interactions, and it's any pair of people is equally likely to interact next. It's sort of a well-mixed room. And your goal is a distributed algorithm design problem, is to design these rules that the people should obey, such that you reach consensus as quickly as possible. So in this nice work by Anglin, Aspes, and Eisenstadt, they came up with this algorithm for solving this problem. So let me explain. So I use this chemical reaction notation. Let me explain what this is. Okay, so we have 3 states, X, Y, Democrats, Republicans, and then B is a blank or undecided. Okay, so what, for example, a reaction like this means is it means that when an X interacts with a B, the B turns into the X, into an X, right? So X plus B goes to X plus X. So that's what the notation means. So what is the intuitive meaning behind this algorithm? So what it says is that when the Democrat and the Republican interact, one of them changes to an I don't know. That's what the first 2 rules say. So it's either this will happen or this happen. And then when an I don't know interacts with a X, it turns into an X. And when I don't know interacts with a Y, it turns into a Y. And this is just another pictorial illustration of the same chemical reaction network, sort of in the way that biologists like to draw things out, sort of indicating catalysis. Yeah, so you can call this chemical caucusing. What Anglo and Asmussen and Eisenstadt were able to show is actually to be able to prove that this is an optimal algorithm for solving this problem. That the expected time to converge, you can prove, is asymptotically log n. So n is the total number of people in the room, and the expected time to converge is probably log n interactions per person. And of course, this is all happening in parallel. So this takes log n time. And you can use a coupon collector argument to show that you need at least log n interactions per person. And this is numerical simulations on a log scale confirming this logarithmic behavior. Okay, so this is a cool distributed algorithm. So around the same time that this algorithm was analyzed in the distributed computing literature, this paper was published in Cell, showing a model of a biological regulatory network that's the same exact network. Of course, they did not make that connection. So these drum-like objects that are shown here are histones, or nucleosomes, complexes of histones. They're proteins that wrap DNA, and they can be in one of 3 states: methylated, unmodified, and acetylated. That controls whether the genes in the DNA that they wrap are turned on or off. And presumably what's happening here is that the cell wants to, it has these groups of genes, N histones, that it wants to, either all be on or all be off, and not in some mixture of the states. And so it's continuously running this consensus algorithm to implement this behavior. So I think that's a really cool connection between the theoretical computer science result yielding insight onto a biological regulatory network. So here we got lucky because these authors essentially drew out the same picture that we saw there. How is there some general way to sort of figure out what is the underlying computational core behind many different regulatory networks. And I just wanted briefly to point out this paper by Luca Cardelli from Microsoft Research, who came up with this general framework for arguing that some more complicated networks can implement or can realize smaller networks. And this sort of provides, for example, an argument that actually a whole bunch of these biological regulatory networks might, at their core, all be implementing this approximate majority algorithm. OK, so that's, I think, a nice example of a chemical algorithm that has a nice story behind it. Of course, I've been thinking about many other algorithms of that sort, and analyzing their computational complexity and error probability and things like that. So I just wanted to give you a taste of sort of what the theory in this field looks like. Now, I want to move on to a few words to say about actual lab implementation. So I have a wet lab at UT Austin where we essentially try to build these chemical algorithms. So what does it mean to implement a chemical reaction network in the test tube, right? So we need to find some molecules that obey these rules, right? So there's some arbitrary rules that you, the programmer, give me, and I need to make molecules that obey these rules. How can I do that? So for a number of years now, I've been interested in DNA nanotechnology as the tool for that. So in particular, DNA, right? So we'll be making these agents out of DNA. But importantly, OK, so just to be clear, we're on the same page, right? So here we're not using DNA as the carrier of genetic information as you're used to from basic biology. Rather, we're using DNA as a basic structural material as a building block. And that's kind of like how we use wood or something like that, which is a biological material, but we use it for other purposes, right? So that's the way we'll use DNA here. OK, so a few words about DNA. OK, so this is a double helix. There's two strands bound together. Each strand consists of a sequence of nucleotides, A, T, C, and G. And what makes the two strands stick together? It's the nucleotides, but they have to match up, right? So there's this, A binds T and C binds G. That, so if the two strands have complementary sequences according to this binding relationship, they bind each other. OK, so I just want to use this cartoon picture of lines to abstract away this more complex 3D, right? So we're going to unwind the helix and just I'll draw a cartoon picture of that sort. So the basic reaction that we're going to compose over and over again to create these large networks is called something, a strand is is called strand displacement. And the basic idea is like this. So here we have a complex like we saw before, except this red strand isn't the full complement of the green strand. Okay? And so what happens if in the solution, right? So it's a little bit shorter. So what happens if in solution we place this complex together with the full complement of the green strand, right? So it starts out, the red strand starts bound to the green strand, and then we add the blue strand, which is the full complement. So as you may expect, it's energetically preferred for the full complement to bind. And so what you have is called a strand displacement reaction, where essentially the blue strand displaces the red strand like this. And the interesting thing is that you can cascade these strand displacement reactions into deep cascades. So here, for example, this blue strand, right, displaces the red strand, which then in turn can displace the purple strand, which can displace the brown strand. So this is how it works. And you can build up cascades like this. Okay, so up to now, this is only signal propagating. I mean, this is not computing. So I just wanted to give you a brief idea of how you can do some more non-trivial kind of computation. So the easiest thing you can do, for example, right, just to give you a taste of how something more complex is possible, if you split this blue strand into two, right? So now both this and this is needed, right? Both input 1 and input 2 is needed to kick off the red strand. And so this is now a form of an AND kind of operation. Okay, so I'm just running out of time. I wanted to, so in a theoretical work, we show that strand displacement cascades are complete for chemical reaction networks. So you're used to this notion of completeness for logic circuits. So for example, a NAND gate is a complete kind of element, which means you can compose it in ways to achieve arbitrary logic circuits. So we can show that this is another kind of completeness for chemical reaction networks, which says that you give me an arbitrary chemical reaction network, and I can compose these strand displacement systems into a network which realizes that chemical reaction network. So to show you two concrete examples from the test tube, of this pipeline, right? So we saw this approximate majority chemical reaction network. This is another one that's an oscillator. So here, these are ideal behaviors, right? This is what we want them to do. So this approximate majority network, we want to converge to the majority opinion. This oscillator one, we want the population of agents in state A, B, and C to oscillate over time. So this is the ideal behavior that we can obtain by simulation. And then we compile them compile these chemical reaction networks into DNA and put it into a test tube and measure the behavior, and we get qualitatively, I mean, similar behavior. So, okay, so one obvious thing at this point to point out is that, you know, if you look at the time scale here, it's hours, and it's many hours. So this is you know, not competitive with digital electronics in any way in terms of speed. But again, that's not the point. The point here is to, again, to put these control modules into environments where we can't put a microcontroller in there. And, you know, and also it can be argued that a lot of the kind of regulatory networks that happen inside of the cells do operate on sort of much longer time scales of minutes and hours. So yeah, so this is done in a test tube, so to give you an idea of sort of the counts of molecules we have here. So this is about 10 to the 11 agents, right? So, you know, 10 to the 11 agents coming to consensus. So that's kind of cute. What are the major challenges? And there are some very major challenges remaining. One is obviously to speed up strand displacement, and we have some ideas to hopefully speed it up by an order of magnitude or more. The other is to reduce error. As you've seen in the previous slide, it's not, you know, it's not behaving quite the way the simulations show. And of course, also we want to embed them into biological material, into cells. And just to give a shout out to Neil and Andrew and Luca at Microsoft Research, who developed some really useful tools for us to reason about strand displacement cascades, including this formal language called DSD for describing and modeling them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. Do we have any questions? Well, Dave sets up. Aram.
So, sometimes in biology experiments, people will label things with radioactive markers. Maybe they'll use NMR to drive a chemical reaction or try to drive something optically. What do you think the prospects are for, for controlling these things in real time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there are all sorts of, for example, photocleavable bases that you can put on DNA. That sort of chemistry that allows you to use light to, to activate or deactivate these cascades. Yeah, so that's potentially a cool application if you can put these into cells and then have this extra layer of control where you sort of shine light and turn it on and off. Yeah, that's yeah. I mean,
Well, let's thank David one more time. So now we have Dave Wecker. He's going to speak about tools, software architectures, and tools for quantum computing. Dave has been at Microsoft for over 20 years. He's worked on a very broad range of areas, including ebooks, the Pocket PC, the handheld PC, speech recognition and machine learning. And now we're lucky to have him working on quantum computing, actually, with our team with Quark here in Redmond. So Dave is now going to talk about architecting software for quantum computers. So welcome, Dave. We'll turn it over.
Thank you. And as Krista just told you, as you can tell, I can't hold a job. But I think I found something I really like and I'm really excited about, and I'd like to share some of that excitement with you today. I'm going to start with an interesting fact which was just corroborated by one of the visitors to the booth before this session, who has one of the biggest supercomputers in the world responsible for, thank you, and basically said 40% of the computation on it is being done with chemical modeling for chemical systems. If you look at this survey, actually over 50% of the world's supercomputing workloads can arguably be done better on a quantum computer when we build them and have them available. So there's a reason there we're interested. And part of that is you don't need a very large quantum computer to do some pretty interesting things. 250 qubits interacting with each other gives you more states than there are particles in the universe. That's a pretty interesting statistic to start from. You get a lot to play with very quickly. And if you look at something like Shor's algorithm and you look at cryptography, breaking a 2,000-bit RSA, the classical numbers are scary, but the quantum numbers are either really good or really scary, depending which side of the fence you're on, in terms of what's possible, even with a pretty slow quantum computer. The types of things you can do are pretty amazing. The problem is there aren't any quantum computers. And one of my biggest concerns is being ready for when they exist. I don't think they're that far away. And we're not training our students early enough to think in a different programming model. So we created Liquid. And Liquid is a simulator of a quantum computer. You can't go too big. If I could go as big as I wanted, I wouldn't need the quantum computer. But I can go to 30 qubits. And that's enough to do some very interesting work. I can do research. I can do analysis. And it's definitely great for academic use. And so we had a lot of goals for the simulator. I'm not going to go into them here. But the important thing is it's fully available for academic use. And I'll give some more details as we get later into the talk. The simulator itself has gone through a number of generations. We're now in the 3rd generation, which is the lowest line there. And you can see things that take 4 days on the current simulator would have taken 3 years on the original. And we're about as efficient as I think I can make it at this point. And it's good enough, as I said, to actually simulate a small quantum computer, but fast enough to actually do interesting work there. So let's start with one of the areas that I spent a lot of time on over the last year, which is quantum chemistry. And the Quark team here at MSR put out a number of papers in 2015 looking at how hard is it really to do quantum chemistry. And we started with a molecule that's of interest to chemists called ferredoxin. This molecule is at the center of photosynthesis. It's the energy transport molecule. It's also what's in your hemoglobin that moves various items around. And you can't do it on a classical computer, period. It's not, oh, we'll find a better algorithm. The problem is as soon as you have an iron in there, you're lower enough in the periodic table that you have non-local interactions. And you can't just approximate them away. Everything falls apart when you do that. So this is lifetime of the universe to ever do this on a classical machine. So we looked at the problem. When we started, state of the art said, oh, this will be about 24 billion years on a quantum computer. Well, that's great. That's a lot faster than lifetime of the universe, but it's not going to do me a lot of good, especially if I want quantum computers used throughout our society. So we started working on this. And we found we could do structural work, parallelizations, typical computer science things. We got this down to 850,000 years. That's better. I'm still not going to sell anybody a quantum computer. Next one got it down to 30 years. Well, at least we're within human lifetimes now. So the second paper helped a lot. But by the 3rd paper, we were down to 5 days. Now we're cooking with gas. This now becomes something people are interested in. And we didn't leave it there. By the 4th paper, we got down to an hour. So we went from 24 billion years to solve this problem to about an hour. And that sounds kind of magical. I mean, how do you pull that off? And by the way, how do you prove this when you don't have a quantum computer? So if we take a look, the top line here is various molecules, starting from hydrogen fluoride up to ferredoxin. and the number of qubits or spin orbitals, they're interchangeable here, that you need to simulate, and the amount of time it's going to take. The top line was before we wrote the first paper, it's what the accepted scaling was. And the first and the second paper were, like I said, mostly structural changes, algorithm improvements, things you would typically do. But along the way, don't forget, we have liquid. We can simulate up to about 30 qubits. So we start simulating these molecules, and they don't take nearly as long as predicted. So we go back to the theorists, and we say, this doesn't look right. Say, oh, no, you didn't do enough molecule. You need to do this. And we went and did that. And still the scaling held. And everything we did, the scaling held. And it turns out nobody made tight estimates. The estimates were all good. They were all correct. But for all sorts of general rules that don't happen in nature, nature is really efficient. And when you're trying to simulate molecules, you can assume nature's doing it the easiest way possible. So by the time we get to the third and the fourth paper, we're actually down to agreeing with what we're seeing in simulation. The point here is simulators like Liquid let you play on a yet-to-be-built quantum computer and start designing algorithms, start finding solutions, and also figuring out what you're going to use a new technology or an exotic technology for. I should mention we just shipped a paper that talks about this little molecule here. This is actually a little piece of the molecule called nitrogenase. This is what the little anaerobic bacteria in the roots of plants does to make fertilizer. It splits nitrogen triple bonds in the atmosphere and turns them into ammonia. This is how you make fertilizer. The process today was invented in the early 1900s, called the Haber-Bosch process. It's 5% of the output of natural gas for the year for the planet is used for this. 3% of the total energy output of the planet. It's expensive. It's one of the reasons that farmers sometimes can't afford to plant crops. And we believe this is the size quantum computer you need to be able to solve this problem. And the paper actually goes into detail of exactly what you will need to build to be able to build a synthetic nitrogenase, something that we can make on an industrial scale and make cheap, available fertilizer. So I'm mentioning a lot here Liquid. I want to bring up the website, and if you don't want to remember the whole URL, stationq.com is our new website, which will point you at all of this. There are videos, there's samples, there's a whole community on GitHub now contributing algorithms, and classes are being done on it. And it's a simulation system. You write in a high-level language, this case F#, and it runs, I should say, on OS X, it runs on Linux, it runs on Windows. Choose your poison. It works wherever you like, and for the academic release, we'll work up to 23 qubits. I should also mention we have two other software efforts. Solid is a compiler. It will actually compile quantum algorithms for quantum hardware. Now, the quantum computers don't exist yet, but qubits exist in the lab, and you can compile into the lab, and eventually it will compile into actual quantum computers. Q-codes is lab software. Since we have to be doing all of this in the labs, we need software to run. And it's a problem today where grad students learn one set of software, go to another lab, and it's completely different, or they're not allowed to take the software with them because it's proprietary to that lab or to a commercial entity. And so we've built an entire system to run any lab. It has nothing to do with quantum. This is any lab where you can control the equipment from a computer. It's IPython based. You can run notebooks, do literate programming with your lab notebook, and then run your experiments. And next week, we're releasing this in full open source form to the world, that everybody will be able to use this in their laboratories in any way that they like. We're hoping to build a community that builds device drivers for all the different lab equipment, and we bring productivity for everybody way up in laboratory environments. So we've touched on one initial application, which is this nitrogenase. We need about 1 to 200 logical qubits. I'll use the word logical. I'm not going to explain too deeply here, but the quality of your qubit says how many physical qubits you need to make a logical qubit. And so the actual quantum computer is much bigger than this. But the actual ones you're computing on from your algorithm look like 1 to 200 in this case. Turns out carbon capture is the same class of problem. If I want to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and reverse global warming, it's about the same problem to solve. So you can see when we get to the 1 to 200 qubit logical range, we're already starting to hit really important, world-changing problems. And this is one of the reasons I'm so excited about this. Material science, high temperature or room temperature superconductors. I want to do organic batteries. There's a good example. We know 1 million candidate molecules that you could make organic batteries out of. But we don't know which ones are good and which ones are bad. The only way right now is to make them in the lab, to actually do the in vivo tests. Have a quantum computer, I can run all 1 million molecules through it and come out the other end and tell you which ones are the ones that, if I pour a soup into a swimming pool, I've got a battery for a solar farm. And I didn't have to mine any heavy metals to do it. That's kind of cool. And of course, this is Microsoft. We care deeply about machine learning. And there's lots of places where quantum computers can help machine learning, both in speed of learning and quality of the models, and even completely new types of models. So these are big areas that we care about that we think early quantum computers would be able to attack. There's a lot of technologies. Basically, anything that has a quantum state, you can turn into a qubit, which is the unit of computation. Why are we interested in all of this? Well, Microsoft's working in that area all the way over on the right, called topological quantum computing. This is thanks to a gentleman, Michael Friedman, who heads our Station Q effort in Santa Barbara. He's the only Fields medalist working in industry, and his expertise is mathematical topology. Turns out there are states of matter that are different topologically, that actually protect against quantum noise. Remember I said how good your qubit is how many you need to make a logical qubit out of how many physical ones. Well, topological qubits are really, really good. And they last a long time, and you need very few physical qubits to make a logical qubit. This led us in 2006 to create Station Q, thanks to Craig Mundy, who's sitting over there, which was the formal effort that we are now in the midst of and trying to bring forth topological quantum computing. And in 2012, the first of these topological entities, or quasi-particles, was viewed in the lab. Since that time, we've debunked all of the arguments of why it's not a topological item, and now we're on our way to building qubits out of them. This is just a little picture of some of the early experiments. In the upper right, the vertical line you see is a nanowire that we grew. This nanowire is made of a special material that lets us make these topological quasi-particles. There's a superconductor under it, a normal conductor, and gates. And this little peak in the middle here, this is the thing that says you have a topological region. And this was, like I said, the early experiment in 2012, but was the first time anyone had ever seen this effect. This is what one of these labs looks like. This happens to be Charlie Marcus's lab at the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen. And the device on the left, the big canister, is where the qubits live. Over on the right is the same refrigerator without the can around it. And the actual qubits are all the way down at the bottom, all the way down at the, in fact, in this picture it would be right there. Everything else is just getting colder and colder and colder and colder to get down to where we need to be. In this case, 20 millikelvin, where 0 is absolute 0. So you're, I forgot how many times colder than outer space, but way down. So these wires I've been describing, we can now build them into crosses so that we can actually move these particles around, because that's how you compute with them. And the first drawing of this happens to be the original drawing from Michael in 2000 showing how you would compute. Well, it turns out just moving them around each other very quickly fills the computational space. You don't have to do a lot of effort, so they're very efficient. They do very high density computations. And then when you take one of these qubits and put it on an island with others, you can then move them around each other. And this is an experiment that's going into the fridge very shortly to actually show the qubits operating and doing computation. What's nice about this design is it's scalable, and I can do more and more qubits by just repeating the design. These are done with semiconductor techniques, so just like you make normal computer chips, eventually you make qubit chips. Of course, you need a lot of classical computation to run a quantum computer. And so we also have an effort in superconducting logic that goes into the fridge to run these. And the problem with working in a new area like this is there's no tools. When we started, for instance, there were no CAD tools for designing and simulating the circuitry, the classical circuitry we need to do. So we built our own tool called the Data Path Compiler that does this. So the point I'm trying to get across here from Microsoft's point of view is we're a systems company. We believe in the entire platform. You have to do everything from fridge design to wires to logic to qubits for what you need to do. So I'm going to skip this. I'm running out of time, but I just was going to touch a couple of the other problems you might attack. This is getting back into when we get into metals, it gets really hard to compute classically. And there are all sorts of areas here that we know we could do on a quantum machine. There are papers available on all of these subjects, but when you do a material, you can take this repeating lattice and instead optimize for a single point, because they're all the same. So pick a point and do a mean field approach to the rest of the lattice. So this makes it easier to simulate, but mean field means you lose all the quantumness. It all becomes classical. So instead, we're going to do a dynamical mean field where we do the probability of a particle jumping on and off this one site at every frequency. So what's the probability continuously across all frequencies, which means you keep the entire model for the system. That impurity can be as complex as these chemical models we showed earlier. Plus, we can model how things hop on and off and a bath of particles that come on and off onto this site. Why am I bringing this all up? Well, it turns out the quantum computer isn't a standalone machine. Think of it more like a GPU. It's an adjunct to your classical computing. There are things in this model. This DMFT, by the way, is a gold standard for how on supercomputers we do this materials modeling. But we take the thing that's easy to do on the classical machine, leave it there, and take the hard thing, which is actually modeling the system, and put that on the quantum computer. So we actually run the simulation of the quantum system on a quantum system, and then we bring it back, we analyze, we look at the errors, we update, and we have a machine learning system. So what we're doing here is classical machine learning of a quantum model. What's really cool about this is when you're done, you just don't have an answer out. You have a model. You have a quantum model you can load efficiently and ask questions of. I want to know diffusion rates. I want to know energy spectra. I want to know catalysis rates, whatever. These are all the things then you can do once you've built a high efficacy model. An equivalent diagram, but a completely different approach, is to do little pieces of these models. Each model, you notice there's these summations. Well, I can do one at a time and sum them all up. The good news for doing something like that is you only need to stay coherent or keep those qubits alive for each one of the terms instead of for the hundreds or thousands of terms that have to be kept together, which means a small quantum computer with physical qubits, you can actually do useful work. The bad news is you're now sampling output. You're not staying coherent. You can't work with the entire model. It's quadratically slower than doing this on a full-scale quantum computer. But with just a few qubits, 14 qubits is enough to find the ground state of water. So I can start doing interesting calculations and prove the point that these systems work and what they do with a very modest amount of hardware. And then finally, back to mentioning SOLID and Q codes. SOLID understands how to compile into all different temperatures, all different areas. I might have an ARM processor at some level, an Intel processor. I might have FPGAs sitting down here. I have all sorts of different hardware, and I need a way to just write an algorithm and have the software tools, as Jan was pointing at. For FPGAs, we're going to need just as much for quantum computing and the mix of classical with quantum. This is what the SOLID code looks like. I'm going to skip all of this except to say that what's interesting is SOLID understands all of this code, understands the classical, understands the quantum. And when you say something like, I want to run this reversibly, I need to do that in a quantum system all the time, it understands how to reverse the classical code, invert the loops, take all the quantum items and flip them into their reversed quantum states, and output code that's just as tight, just as good, but is automatically translate it into something I need instead of hand coding all of this, where you may have millions of operations you need to do. And a word about Q codes. I had already said that there are lots of tools out there, and the problem is there's no standard, there's no way to get among them. And yes, I know we're creating yet another standard, hence the XKCD. But what's really nice is the code is very tight. This runs an entire experiment, and this was about 4 pages of code in one of the other tools in LabVIEW that we just translated over into Q codes. And we're actually using this in our labs now, and we're actually running using Q codes, and I look forward to releasing that. And finally, the top URL is all you really need to learn if you want to go directly to Liquid. There's the one at the bottom, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dave. Is there a question for Dave?
So you talked about, I guess, solving nitrogen fixation, all these problems, but I mean, just because you have the structure of the molecule doesn't mean you'll ever find a catalyst that will give us that. I mean, that's...
It's actually, we're being much more, what's the word I want? Much less lofty goals, okay? The goal here really is we already have a technique on classical machines called DFT, density functional theory, which lets us model and figure out how to play with it. The problem is we don't know if the functionals are any good. The quantum machine can model the functionals and tell you if you should believe the model. So we're actually not doing the search on the quantum computer for what's the right molecule. Way too big, way too much. All we're doing are the active states of the nitrogenase molecule, enough to tell to believe what we're getting out of the classical machine or not. And so, again, we're working with quantum chemists, in this case, Marcus Ryer at ETH Zurich, who's been working on nitrogenase for 20 years. He says, this is the one piece they're missing. This is the piece they need to be able to go after it. And this is something that, again, can be done in 1 to 200 qubits in a length of time we believe is reasonable to do with earlier machines. And so, yeah, when I say solving this, it's solving the piece that classical can't do. And we go back to classical. That's a constant repeat or refrain for the things that I believe is the right way to do this, is carve out that one kernel that's the problem and make it work.
I'll ask our other 2 speakers, Jan and David, to come up. So we'll open it up for questions about, well, questions for any of our 3 speakers. Does someone have a question? I know there was a question earlier for the FPGA. For Jan. Did you?
Yes.
So hi, I am Jon Stojka from UC Berkeley. So I have a question regarding the FPGA. When typically a functionality you implement in the FPGA becomes prevalent, and you have a strong use case on a larger scale, you may decide to, and you'd comment on that, decide to take that functionality and implement in an ASICs. So I'm just wondering if you can provide some rule of thumbs at when is that threshold when you consider implementing a functionality from FPGAs to put it in ASICs.
Well, this is the business model problem for the FPGA vendors. Anytime anything really good gets done in an FPGA, someone says, oh, I'll just make a cheaper ASIC. Those lookup tables and configurable interconnect are enormously complicated under the hood. Tens of thousands of CMOS transistors go into one of those configurable logic blocks. So when you settle on a good architecture for a problem, it's quite profitable to move it into full custom. The other economics, though, are that Xilinx and Altera/Intel can afford to go and build these 14 and 16 nanometer fab chips. Whereas if you're building an ASIC, it's enormously expensive to go and use those best implementation technologies. So everybody's staying back at 28 nanometers or bigger. So there is that trade-off. I wouldn't be surprised in the data center world to see at Intel, for example, provide libraries of domain-specific accelerators that they make available to their data center customers. And then after a couple of years of seeing large uptake of particular ones, turn that FPGA representation into another fixed logic block on that huge data center SoC, and thereby get the energy efficiency of having just regular wires and transistors rather than the configurable logic. So in some sense, FPGAs, as Intel integrates FPGAs into these server chips, it will accelerate the rate of exploration of new accelerator architectures, and we'll get faster innovation in that world. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Is there oh, Al? Yes, here.
Thank you. This is a question for Jan and David. What I admire about the Liquid work, being a software person, is that here you have a programming language in which you can write algorithms and run them on top of hardware. And if we look at the situation with exascale supercomputing, the proposed exascale supercomputers cannot run the petascale software. So what kind of programming language would you propose, both for your FPGA work or your reaction network, the chemical reaction networks, that would admit of software portability through different generations of your technologies?
First, I had a question for you. I didn't understand why you can't run the workloads, the exascale workloads on the petascale machines, or vice versa, I beg your pardon.
I served on a panel looking at what kind of programming language and compiler architecture would be suitable for the exascale world. And that's when I discovered that the codes for the petascale supercomputers were so optimized to the petascale architectures that those optimizations would not translate to the exascale world. There's also the case that in the exascale world, when you're dealing with billions of transistors, the fault tolerance and error recovery mechanisms have to be built into the infrastructure, which is not currently there. So from my limited perspective, I think software for exascale is in disarray at the moment. That's one of the biggest problems of DOE. And from the early days, I was in the group at Bell Labs that developed Unix and C and so on. There was a big effort for portability of software going from one generation to the next. There were things like the portable C compiler and so on. So software for many people is the most expensive part of computing. So it's just a plea for the hardware designers to take it easy on the software designers.
I'm still not entirely sure how to answer your question, except that as the exotic technology of FPGAs becomes the mainstream, when you can go and get these chips in your data centers, eventually in your clients, when cloud providers provide this stuff, it will allow innovation in architecture at a much higher rate than we've seen. We've kind of had very slow innovation in computer architecture. The big machines still look like souped up bags of 386s, you know. So, but I still don't know how to answer the question about the programming language side, I'm afraid. Sorry. Okay.
Maybe David, do you have any comments on higher level languages for molecular computing?
Yeah, I think that's a open, it's a big open question in the sense that, I showed these chemical reaction networks and I sort of thought maybe even use the language of, this is a program, sort of we're thinking about chemical reaction networks as a programming language. But this is very low level programming language. And it's not clear, if you want to specify some kind of high level function, what's the best way to do that. And I think a lot of, in the molecular programming field, this sort of is a problem similar to distributed computing people where, again, you have sort of a high level specification. And just like over there, we don't have a von Neumann architecture where you have a central, it's all distributed. It's not clear what's the best way to think about organizing it at the high level.
Great. So I'd like to close with one final question for each of our speakers today, being that we're at Faculty Summit and we have many professors and department chairs coming from universities around the world. How do we go about preparing the next generation of students for programming and architecting for these types of technologies, for these three and then for others that are coming down the pipeline? We need a generation of students and eventually engineers, programmers, computer scientists, and so forth that can take advantage of these technologies just as they're learning to take advantage of distributed computing. So I'm curious for each of you, what can the professors in the audience take away back to their departments?
I have two comments. The first is, as I mentioned, the demise of Moore's Law and Dennard scaling. I think that it's the Full Employment Act for performance engineering. So there's enormous waste in our software and hardware to abstraction stacks. So to the extent that you have some content in your courses about performance modeling and have someone in your computer science program, you should say, go and get some code off GitHub and study it and speed it up by a factor of 10. Would be a good exercise somewhere in their curriculum, because in the future when the boss says do 10 times more X, the only way to do that will be to take X and make it 10x faster. The second comment about availability of this FPGA platform stuff. In the past, it's been a drag. You've had to go and buy boards and install horrible tools and so on. But there's a number of efforts to make the FPGAs in the cloud or in the data center available over the internet. So I understand there's a Catapult installation that's coming up at TAC that you can start trying out, and there's another one at EPFL. And if you go to research.microsoft.com/catapult, you can get links so that you can have students actually go and try out these platforms. Thank you.
Dave?
Well, I lobbied really hard to get Liquid out the door for academic use for the simple reason that today in quantum computing there are 4 fundamental algorithms. That's it. You're not going to build a new computing paradigm on 4 algorithms. We need algorithms. There's no reason there aren't more, but there aren't a lot of people programming. There aren't a lot of people thinking about what you need to do to solve things with a quantum algorithm. And so getting this into the hand of students, getting this all the way down to high school level, where we're teaching programming, why not teach different ways of thinking about it? In our own work, we found that by going after hard problems on the quantum side, we found new ways of thinking about them. We came back and found solutions on the classical side we never would have thought of. And we've improved a lot of our classical algorithms by thinking of it as a quantum problem first. So I think from an educational point of view, from building a group of expertise in quantum algorithms, in approaches, in programmability, that when these machines finally show up, which for me I don't believe is that long, I intend to be around for them, that I would like to see that the people are there who have the expertise and the students have been taught and are able to do work there.
David?
So for me, the interesting thing in terms of education is that, I interact a lot with biologists, and so biology has accepted computer science as a source of tools. But I think we have a lot to offer as as a source of paradigms and ideas, right? And somehow I feel like in our education system we need to sort of emphasize that computer science sort of extends beyond electronics into potentially a lot of other settings where we're sort of missing right now. And I think, for example, physics has somehow done that quite well. There are a lot of physicists, entering a lot of other fields that sort of bringing ideas. And I think computer science can do that as well. And sort of, for example, in my course, I try to attract people from a lot of other fields in biology, and that's sort of the main thing that I try to emphasize.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming to the session today. Let's thank our 3 speakers once again.